Hey people, voice talking to you. Today, we are going to be looking at a game called Zompiercer. And if that sounds like a made-up word, that's because it is. It's a mashup between, well, zombie and Snowpiercer. The zombie part is pretty self-explanatory, but the Snowpiercer part, well, Snowpiercer is a movie about a train that is surviving a apocalyptic winter by constantly moving. And, well, the train aspect is pretty much the only part of that that carries over. So, in this game, you are a conductor running a train in the zombie apocalypse, moving from location to location, finding new stuff, and then you bring all that stuff back to your train to build up the cars into a base and craft equipment. Before we get started, though, as always, you can find a link to this game down in the description. It is still in early access, I believe, and it's a pretty small development team, so go give them some love. And also you can find a link to my Twitch stream. I stream pretty much every day of the week, and you can come and see me live playing these games that I'm reviewing now before the video goes up. So if you wanted to see the VOD for this game, those should still be up at the time this video drops. So, a brief overview of the story of Zompiercer, for what it's worth at least. The world has collapsed, humanity is in shambles after the Walking Dead have taken over, and the only way that people are getting supplies from port to port and from settlement to settlement is through the use of the rail system, with a group called the Zombie Busters. Now, we are a recruit for the Zombie Busters, but everything goes wrong right before we're about to start our work. And then we have to hastily, well, not really hastily, slowly drag all of the materials from the base to our train before we set off on our long voyage into the unknown. So this game is set up less like an open world survival crafting game and more like The Last Station, where you will move from location to location and then you will do events and finish quests and collect resources at each location you stop at. Now, you'd probably imagine you won't be spending a ton of time at each of these locations, but you would be very, very wrong. The train moves probably not all that often unless you are cool with leaving a bunch of stuff behind, because there is tons of stuff to find at each of these locations. Not a ton of variety to these things, to be honest, but a lot of things. There is materials and weapons and ammunition and tons of food and medical supplies. There's a lot of stuff to haul back. That's obviously going to slow down the pacing a bit from what you might expect, but unfortunately, the pacing of this game is its number one issue. The pacing is very off. Now, I'm not huge on games limiting your inventory space to begin with, mostly because it becomes frustrating, especially in survival games where you need to be hauling lots of materials. And it can get even worse when they make it a bit too realistic, and carrying one log, for example, fills up your entire inventory. Now, there's obviously reasons why some games do this to limit the amount of gear you can carry, but with Zompiercer, it's a bit too much. With the amount of stuff you have to carry and the amount of weight you can carry starting out, it just doesn't add up. Zompiercer ends up slowing down immensely, especially at the start when you have low inventory space, because it takes a lot of trips to get all the materials back to your train, and even then, you gotta find somewhere to store it. The amount of inventory space is just too small for the distance and amount of stuff you have to move. It slows the game down too much. It's just not worth it. Frankly, the whole theming of the game is based around movement. You're surviving on a train, and assumedly the reason that the trains are what can make it through the zombie-infested territory is that they are moving too fast for the zombies to catch up. But there's not really any penalty for sitting still for long periods of time, and frankly, you have to if you want to get all of this stuff back to your base. And if you don't grab all that stuff, you're going to be missing out on a lot of upgrades, you're going to be very limited in what you can build, and frankly, those are two of the best parts of the game. Honestly, the base building is probably my favorite part of the game. Putting together these carriages with this mishmash of different parts made from this scrap that you hauled back or scavenged from zombie-infested locations is a really satisfying mechanic. And the variety of ways you can customize your carriages, from warehouses to kitchens to workshops, living areas, bathrooms, gardens even, is really interesting and a really satisfying way to encourage material collection. Unfortunately, that feeds into the issue of making everybody want to haul all of the materials back to their train, which takes forever, but that's besides the point. There's a surprising variety of stuff you can actually build on the train. Some of it, however, feels a bit unnecessary. For example, in the entire time that I've played this game, I have never built a kitchen, nor a rain catcher, nor garden boxes. Reason being, there's just so much food and water laying around that there's no point. I've never built a medical table either, because there's so many meds laying around that there's no reason to produce them myself. And that does lead into another big issue with the game's theming, and that's that it doesn't really feel like the apocalypse. Sure, there's zombies walking around and you're the only person, but also there's food everywhere, you're pretty much set for life if you clear out a few houses everywhere you stop. The zombies, 1-to-1 or a pushover, 1-to-5 is maybe a little threatening. The only major threat comes in when you're cornered, or there's a big guy. Let me talk briefly about how the combat works, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Melee combat, you have two options: attack and dodge. There is a stealth system implemented. It's pretty basic. You can crouch, it gives you a sneak meter down at the bottom center of your screen, and when you move, that sneak meter goes up. That means you make more noise. If you're in a zombie's line of sight, they're more likely to see you, and if you sneak up on them, you can do certain things like stab them with a dagger, which will deal extra damage, or shoot them with a bow, which will also deal extra damage. Aside from that, ranged combat is exactly what you'd expect. You can dodge, just like in melee combat, run away, and shoot. All of these things cost stamina, and that's really the only binding factor of combat, is your stamina and your health. Health is pretty easy to come by. I've actually found so many medkits that I've had to start storing them, and those completely restore your health. So if you're in combat and can manage to use one of them, you're fine. The only time you really die is if you take so much damage before you can use the medkit. And the big guys are the ones that can cause problems for that. Now, the major issues with the basic zombies mostly boil down to two problems, and that is that they don't deal enough damage, and they're pretty stupid. Stereotypical zombies, so we'll let that part slide. But you can sneak up on a lot of them from the front, and they're only programmed to do two things, and that is follow the player and swipe at them. Which means, if you, for example, break off the arm that they attack with, they are incapable of using the other one, and will sit there swinging their stump at you in a completely futile gesture until you either bash their head in, or something bigger comes along. Now, on that note, the game does have a very interesting variety of different zombie types. In addition to the standard zombie everyman, that's literally their name, there's also fast zombies and spitter zombies that spit poison that hurts you and heals enemies. I hate them. There's also coach zombies, which will randomly sprint at you. There's exploder zombies, which get faster when they take damage. There's even a few boss zombies here and there at special points during the game. And these special mutated zombies are what really makes the combat interesting and the world threatening. I even saw one pop out with a bush on its back. That's right, the bush crawled out of the ground and started throwing things at me. I don't know what they were throwing at me, but it was a painful and terrifying experience, but one I enjoyed immensely. If they double down on these sorts of varieties of zombies, make the game a bit more varied and the combat a bit more dangerous by maybe increasing the amount of zombies or the amount of damage they deal, then they'll have a pretty solid basis for a decent combat system. It doesn't have to be super complicated, but giving the player a few more options and the enemy a few more tricks up their sleeves would definitely keep players on their toes a bit more. Though Zompiercer isn't what I would call an open world game, it certainly tries to be. And in some ways it succeeds, and in some ways it really fails. The way it succeeds is by having some really fantastic points of interest that you stop at. These points of interest are all handmade, so they're not randomized in any way, and you will rarely see repeating elements, actually. Sure, you'll see the same assets over and over again, but they're laid out in different ways to hide jump scares and traps and loot and weapons and armor and all sorts of little secrets here and there for you to find. And the maps that you can walk around at are actually pretty vast, and this actually hurts the game quite a bit. The issue isn't that there's lots of space for your train to cover. Frankly, I wish there was more time between stops for me to do things on the train while it's moving, and to make the fuel a bit more prevalent. The biggest issue is that the secrets that are on the map are always hidden really far away from the train. Just hiding your stuff really far away from everybody else and making them spend 15 minutes walking to and from those locations is not a valid and exciting way to encourage your players to explore. In fact, it sort of just makes them frustrated, especially when they have to carry back all of their loot. That's right, we're back to the same problem of not enough inventory space. If you want to get everything, you're going to have to spend a lot of time walking. You can eventually find a robot dog, and this dog has all sorts of different uses. First and foremost, and my favorite use, is that you can put bags on it and it can carry stuff for you, which makes the trips a lot shorter. Of course, he still walks slow as sin, but he's doing his best, so we'll give him a pass. You can also attach turrets to his back, create different upgrades for him, and use him as a weapon or a healer, depending on how you want to fit him out. That said, I don't have any footage of this dog, because 8 hours into the game, I still hadn't found him. Of course, I know where he is, because I found him the first time I played, but 8 hours and still no dog. So that should say what needs to be said about that. To quickly speak on the graphics and the sound, I like the sound design, but there's pretty much no music, which is something they're definitely going to want to remedy. I understand there is a gramophone that you can build in your train, but when you're walking for 15, 20, 30 minutes back and forth between these distant points of interest, you're going to want to have some sort of ambient music play. The graphics in this game are a bit weak, but that's fine. This is a small developer and a pretty large project, all things considered. I would recommend they spruce up some of the textures just a little bit so they're not quite so grainy, remove some of the post-processing type stuff, and I would add in as many more assets as they can. The more assets that you have, the less you have to reuse. So to summarize with some quick pros and cons, I like the base building a lot. It's really enjoyable to build this cozy home on wheels and attach defenses, put together all these different crafting benches to make room for your stuff, and make a home out of literally nothing more than a platform. And going and finding the materials and bringing them back to do all this is a satisfying incentive. However, the con is that you have to drag all that stuff back to your train, and doing so takes far too long, not only because points of interest are way too far away, but everything's too heavy and it takes too long to move it. Combat is interesting. I like it for the most part, but it can become very repetitive when you're fighting regular zombies over and over again. So until you get a fair distance into the game, combat will be pretty slow. On the other hand, fighting against all of the different mutated zombie types with different AIs and strategies and abilities is really cool, and having to change up the way you fight keeps you on your toes just enough to keep it interesting. At the end of the day, I really like this game. The concept, the style, the art, the way it's going about what it wants to do is really cool. Sure, the mobile-based survival thing isn't a new concept, but the way they're doing it here could be very different. I would recommend making a lot of the mechanics more prevalent, because currently the survival stuff feels pretty tacked on, the combat is a little too easy, and the ability to attach defenses and stuff to your train doesn't really come into effect unless you're being besieged at a certain point in the game. So the addition of maybe random encounters along the road, or when you're stopped, or when you're sleeping even, could be a really good addition to this kind of game. It's a bit grindy, it's kind of slow, and it can certainly drag on, but what they have going here with Zompiercer is definitely something I would keep an eye on. As long as they clean up what needs to be cleaned up, add some more polish, include some more variety, and maybe even switch up some of the mechanics a bit, Zompiercer could turn out to be an incredibly charming and unique Odyssey survival game through a post-apocalyptic world. Personally, and honestly, I'm excited to see how this game develops. I've always been a big fan of these sorts of Odyssey survival games with mobile bases like Raft and Volcanoids, and this is one that I'm really rooting for. Even if it's a bit rough now, I'm hoping it can turn into something really fantastic in the future. But that'll do it for me. I'm the voice in your head. Thanks so much for listening, and you'll be hearing from me again real soon.